The night was heavy with silence, and yet inside my chest, the noise of grief thundered endlessly. My name is Fani, and the story I carry is not one of simple sorrow, but of wounds, carved deep into my soul by the cruelty of others. My father and mother were everything to me. They were not rich, they were not powerful, but they were kind and honest, living each day with dignity. We lived in a small house at the edge of the town. It was modest, but filled with warmth and laughter. That was before everything was taken from me. I still remember the day when the shadows fell on our family. My father had always worked hard as a carpenter, making furniture with his bare hands. My mother helped him, while also taking care of the household. People trusted them because they never cheated anyone. But kindness is often a target for cruelty. There were men in our town who despised my father because he refused to pay bribes or bow down to their corruption. One of them was a wealthy merchant with greedy eyes and a cruel smile. He wanted my father's small workshop for himself, and when my father refused to sell it, the threats began. At first, my father tried to stay calm. He told us not to worry, that justice would always prevail. But justice is fragile when power is in the hands of the wicked. Soon enough, those men spread lies about him, claiming he had stolen wood from their warehouses. They bribed officials, twisted the truth, and turned neighbors against us. My mother cried in silence at night, holding me close, whispering that everything would be all right, even though her eyes told a different story. Then came the night that shattered everything. Our workshop was set on fire. Flames rose to the sky, swallowing the years of hard work my parents had built with their hands. My father tried to save what he could, but the fire was too strong. The men stood from afar, watching with satisfaction, while the townspeople turned their backs, afraid to interfere. That night I saw my father fall to his knees, his face lit by the orange glow of destruction. I saw my mother clutch him, her tears mixing with the smoke, and I felt something inside me break, something that could never be repaired. The days that followed were darker still. Without the workshop, my father had no income. The men made sure no one would hire him. They spread more lies, poisoning every chance we had to start again. My mother became ill from the stress and sorrow, coughing endlessly, as if her body was breaking apart. We struggled for food, for medicine, for hope. I watched the light in their eyes dim little by little, and then, like a cruel twist of fate, both of them were taken from me. My father's heart gave out one cold morning. My mother followed him not long after, her fragile body unable to fight any longer. I stood at their graves alone, the wind cold against my skin. The townspeople did not come to mourn. They whispered among themselves, blaming my parents for their own fate. The men who destroyed us walked proudly through the streets, richer than ever, their laughter echoing like poison. That was the moment when grief hardened into something else. A fire began to burn inside me, one not of destruction, but of vengeance. I swore that I would not let their deaths be forgotten. I swore that the men who ruined my parents would pay for every tear they caused. I was no longer the quiet daughter they once pitied. I became the keeper of their memory, and I carried within me a storm, waiting to be unleashed. As I left the graveyard that day, my hands trembling, I whispered a promise to my parents, resting beneath the earth. I will make them remember your names. I will make them regret the day they chose to destroy us. And so began my path into the darkness of revenge. Days turned into weeks after the burial of my parents, and each morning I woke with the same weight pressing on my chest. The world seemed empty without their presence, yet at the same time filled with the mocking laughter of those who had caused their deaths. I wandered through the town with hollow eyes, ignored by neighbors who once shared our bread and smiles. Now they avoided me, as though misfortune was a disease they feared to catch. But grief cannot be the only companion of the living. Within the ashes of sorrow grew a seed of determination. I began to watch carefully the movements of the men who had destroyed us. I memorized their routines, the places they visited, the way people treated them with false respect. They were kings of this rotten town, drunk with power and blind to the pain they left behind. Each detail I gathered was like a stone added to the foundation of my revenge. I had no money, no allies, and no shelter beyond the broken house left behind by my parents. At night, the wind passed through the cracks in the walls, chilling my bones, but I endured it. Hunger clawed at my stomach, but I bore the pain because anger filled me more than any food could. I started working secretly in places where no one recognized me, cleaning stalls, carrying heavy loads, anything that gave me a few coins. Every coin I saved, I considered a weapon for the future. Sometimes I would stand in front of the merchant's grand house, staring at the glowing lights within, listening to the sound of his family's laughter. He had everything he desired, yet he took from those who had nothing. My fists clenched until my nails cut into my skin. I wondered if he remembered my father's face, or if my mother's tears had already faded from his memory. To him, we were probably nothing more than obstacles crushed beneath his feet. That thought only sharpened the blade of my resolve. There were nights when despair whispered to me, telling me to give up, that I was powerless against men with wealth and influence. I would cry into the darkness, my body shaking with the ache of loneliness. But then I would remember my father's hands, scarred from years of labor, and my mother's gentle smile despite her exhaustion. They deserved more than to be forgotten. Their deaths cried out for justice, so I began to train my mind and heart. I read whatever scraps of books I could find about law, about trade, about human weakness. I listened to the conversations of drunk men in taverns, catching secrets spilled carelessly. I was preparing myself, shaping myself from a broken girl into something more dangerous. The day would come when I would no longer be the victim. The day would come when the world would know my parents did not die in vain. And when that day arrived, those who mocked us would kneel before the weight of their sins. The first crack in their armor appeared one evening when I overheard a conversation at the marketplace. Two men who worked for the merchant were arguing, their voices low but sharp, accusing each other of stealing money meant for their master. I stood nearby, pretending to choose vegetables, but every word entered my ears like fire. Greed was not only in the heart of the master, but also in the servants who served him. That greed could become my weapon. From that day, I observed the workers more closely. Some were loyal out of fear, some out of the coins they received, but a few were restless, dissatisfied, and careless. I noticed one in particular, a man named Raka, who often drank until his tongue became loose. When his pockets were empty, he would gamble, and when he lost, he cursed his master for paying too little. I knew then that every man has a weakness, and his could be turned into my advantage. But I was not yet ready to act. I was still a shadow without power, and shadows must learn patience. I spent my nights writing on scraps of paper, recording details of every rumor I heard, every flaw in their lives, every secret they thought hidden. My mother once told me that knowledge is the sharpest blade, and I held those words close as I gathered information like a hunter setting traps. Sometimes doubt returned to torment me. I was only a girl with nothing but anger and memories. They were men with wealth, guards, and influence that reached even the authorities. How could I stand against them without being crushed again? Yet each time I felt fear, I remembered the flames consuming our workshop and the cries of my mother as she held my father. Fear turned into fuel, and despair turned into determination. I worked harder, taking jobs that brought me closer to their world. I cleaned tables at the tavern where their allies often gathered. I delivered goods to the market stalls that supplied their households. I kept my head down, silent and invisible, while my eyes absorbed everything. And slowly, piece by piece, the map of their corruption unfolded before me. It was not only the merchant who ruined my family. There were others, men who gained profit from his schemes, officials who closed their eyes to injustice, and neighbors who betrayed us to protect themselves. The web was larger than I thought, but the larger it became, the more cracks I saw. I swore to myself as I looked at the stars one cold night that I would strike not only at the merchant, but at all who had blood on their hands. The path ahead would be long and dangerous, but I had nothing left to lose. My heart belonged to vengeance, and vengeance would be my guide. The night I chose to approach, Raka was filled with uncertainty, yet my heart beat steady with purpose. I found him in the back corner of a tavern, his eyes red from drink and his hands trembling as he lost another handful of coins to a crooked card game. I waited until his curses turned into weary silence, and then I sat near him, speaking softly so no one else could hear. I told him I knew where he could find easy money if he was willing to listen. At first he laughed, mocking me as nothing more than a desperate girl. But his laughter faded when I slipped a single silver coin onto the table. His eyes followed it with hunger. I had saved that coin for months, but I knew it would serve a greater purpose here than in my pocket. Greed tightened its grip on him, and slowly he leaned closer. From that moment, a dangerous alliance was born. Through Raka, I learned what went on behind the walls of the merchant's grand house. He spoke of secret dealings, of goods smuggled at night, of money laundered through fake accounts. He revealed the merchant's obsession with power, how he kept records of every transaction locked away in a hidden chest in his study. Most importantly, Raka told me of the merchant's enemies, rival traders who despised him but lacked the courage to confront him. My heart beat faster with each word, because information was no longer a dream, but a weapon in my hand. I treated Raka carefully, never giving him more than a taste of what he desired, just enough to keep him talking. He thought he was using me, but in truth, I was weaving him into my plan. Each night I returned to my broken house and wrote down everything he said until my table was covered with notes. I could see patterns forming, a roadmap leading toward the downfall of the man who destroyed my parents. Still, doubt lingered in my chest. What if Raka betrayed me? What if my steps were too obvious? But then I remembered the graves of my father and mother, the loneliness of standing there with no one to comfort me. Fear became a luxury I could not afford. One evening, as I watched the merchant pass through the marketplace, surrounded by guards and sycophants, I whispered to myself that the day of his fall was approaching. He walked with arrogance, believing himself untouchable, but already the ground beneath his feet was beginning to crack, and I was the one holding the hammer. With every secret Raka spilled, I felt the storm inside me grow stronger, but secrets alone could not destroy the merchant. I needed proof. Something that could tear his mask of respectability from his face and expose him before those who bowed to him. Proof was the blade that would cut through the lies and finally make the town see the truth. I began to plan carefully. Raka had told me about the chest in the merchant's study, where records of illegal trade were kept. It was guarded not by locks alone, but by fear. For the merchant trusted that no one would dare to cross his threshold. Yet fear was no longer in my heart. What I feared most had already happened when my parents were buried beneath the cold earth. Nothing else could hurt me more than that. Night after night, I studied the merchant's house from the shadows. I memorized the shifts of the guards, the moments when lamps were extinguished, the path that servants took when delivering food or carrying out waste. My hunger for justice sharpened my mind until every detail became a weapon. At the same time, I sowed whispers in the marketplace, using the information Raka had given me. I spread small rumors among merchants and buyers. I spoke of shipments gone missing, of goods arriving spoiled, of debts left unpaid. I never mentioned the merchant's name, but suspicion is like fire, and once it sparks, it spreads quickly. Soon people began to wonder if the man they trusted so much was truly as strong as he appeared. But this was only the beginning. My true aim was the chest, the heart of his empire. Raka agreed to help me, not out of loyalty, but out of greed, for I promised him a share of what we might find. I knew he was dangerous, yet I accepted the risk because every war demands sacrifices. On a moonless night, I stood near the back gate of the mansion, my breath steady, my hands trembling, not with fear, but with anticipation. Raka was inside, distracting one of the guards with drink. My moment had come. I slipped through the shadows, silent as a memory, and crossed into the world of the man who thought he was untouchable. Every step I took echoed with the voices of my parents, urging me forward. I was not only their daughter anymore. I was the blade of their justice, the storm of their vengeance. And soon, the man who burned our lives would feel the weight of my resolve. The house of the merchant was vast and silent, its walls heavy with the weight of stolen wealth. As I stepped across the polished floors, I felt the coldness of greed, pressing against me from every corner. I moved carefully, every sound of my breath a reminder that discovery meant death. Yet my resolve was stronger than my fear. Raka had told me the chest was kept in the study at the far end of the second floor. The path to it was not simple. Guards patrolled the corridors, and servants moved, even in the late hours. But I had memorized their patterns, every pause, every turn, every careless yawn of a tired watchman. I slipped between shadows as though I had been born from them. When I reached the door of the study, my heart pounded so hard I feared it would betray me. The door was locked, as expected, but I had stolen a set of thin wires from the blacksmith shop weeks before. My father had once taught me patience when shaping wood, telling me that the smallest movements could create the strongest frames. I remembered his words now as I worked on the lock. Sweat trickled down my forehead, but finally the door opened with a soft click. Inside the study, the air smelled of old paper and secrets. The chest stood against the wall, dark and heavy. My hands trembled as I knelt before it. Breaking it open was not easy, but determination gave me strength. When the lid finally lifted, the sight before me stole my breath. Stacks of documents lay inside. records of illegal shipments, bribes paid to officials, debts forced upon desperate families. There were names of men in power who accepted his gold in exchange for silence. There were letters proving alliances with criminals who traded in weapons and human misery. Each page was poison, and in my hands, it became the cure for the lies that had destroyed my parents. I gathered as many papers as I could hide within my bag, but then something caught my eye at the bottom of the chest, something that made my blood run cold. A familiar name written in bold strokes. It was my father. There was a contract, forged and false, claiming he had stolen wood and owed the merchant money. My parents' downfall had been carefully planned long before the fire. Tears blurred my vision, but anger burned hotter. I closed the chest and stood, my bag heavy with proof, my heart heavy with grief. This was more than revenge now. This was justice long overdue. When I left the merchant's mansion that night, the weight of the bag on my shoulder felt heavier than stone, yet lighter than air. He had thought his lies were buried deep, but now they lived in my hands, and with them, I carried the power to shatter him. Still, I knew I could not act recklessly. If I exposed everything too quickly, his allies would bury the truth before it spread. I needed patience. I needed to strike with precision. The next days, I moved quietly through the town, planting seeds of doubt. Where they would grow fastest, I slipped copies of the merchant's false contracts into the hands of small traders who already hated him. I left anonymous letters at the doors of families who had suffered under his greed, reminding them that they were not alone and that proof existed of his corruption. I whispered carefully to traveling merchants so that rumors would spread beyond the walls of our town. Every whisper became a spark, and soon, sparks turned into flames. People began questioning the merchant more openly. Why had certain debts suddenly appeared? Why were shipments disappearing without explanation? Why did officials favor him so strongly, when others were punished harshly for smaller crimes? The air of blind respect that once surrounded him began to crack, and for the first time, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. When he walked through the marketplace, Raka proved useful again, though I never trusted him fully. He brought me news from within the mansion. The merchant shouted at his servants, accused his guards of betrayal, and grew restless at night. He searched his study in panic, certain that someone had stolen from him, though he did not yet know who. I almost smiled at the thought of him, pacing in fear, the way my mother once paced in despair. But my work was far from finished. The papers I had taken were enough to ruin his reputation, but I wanted more. I wanted him broken in body and spirit, the way he had broken my parents. I wanted him to feel the same loneliness I felt standing at their graves, with no one by my side, so I prepared for the next step. It was not enough for him to be hated. He had to be abandoned by the very people who once bowed to him. Only then would he understand the pain of losing everything, and only then would my parents' voices rest in peace. The cracks in the merchant's power were visible. Now, but cracks alone would not bring him down. I knew that to destroy a man like him, I needed to turn his allies against him. He stood tall because others supported his weight. If I cut away those supports, he would collapse into the dust. Among the papers I had stolen were letters, detailing bribes and promises he had made to local officials and rival traders. Each letter was a blade, and I began to place them carefully, where they would cut the deepest. To one trader, I revealed how the merchant had secretly undercut his prices while pretending to be his partner. To another, I sent proof that the merchant had bribed an official to ruin his shipment. To the officials themselves, I slipped copies of their own signatures beside notes of payment, making them fear that exposure was close. The result was swift and satisfying. Distrust spread among them like a disease. Traders who once praised the merchant now muttered against him in private. Officials who once bowed to him now avoided his gaze in public. He grew restless, shouting louder each day, trying to tighten his grip on those who were already slipping away. Rekka reported that the merchant accused everyone of betrayal, even his closest allies. Servants whispered that his temper had turned violent, that he broke objects in his rage and refused to eat. He was a man drowning in the sea of his own corruption, and I was the unseen storm pushing the waves higher. Yet I knew the danger grew as well. A cornered beast is more vicious than one at ease. The merchant ordered his guards to search the town for spies, threatening anyone who dared to speak against him. I kept to the shadows, careful with every step, but fear could not stop me now. The image of my father, kneeling in front of the burning workshop, haunted me every night. It reminded me that this fight was not about survival, but about justice. I waited in silence, watching as the merchant's empire of lies turned against itself. The men who had destroyed my parents now quarreled among one another, their trust shattered, their greed exposed. I felt the tide turning. The moment of his true downfall was near, and when it came, I would be there to watch him crumble beneath the weight of his sins. The day of reckoning approached like a storm on the horizon. The town was already filled with whispers, and I knew that only one final strike remained to bring the merchant to his knees. The documents I had taken were weapons, but weapons meant little if they were never revealed in the open. I decided that the marketplace, the heart of the town where everyone gathered, would become the stage of his downfall. I prepared carefully, hiding copies of the papers in places where no guard could find them. I made sure that traders, officials, and common people alike would be there when the truth was revealed. The night before, I met Raka one last time. I said to him that tomorrow the merchant will taste the ruin he poured upon others. Raka smirked, his breath heavy with alcohol, and replied that he only wanted to see the man scream as everything was taken away. I looked into his eyes and answered that scream or silence. What mattered was justice for my parents. When morning came, the marketplace overflowed with noise and color. People bargained, children ran between stalls, and in the center, the merchant stood with his guards, speaking loudly about loyalty and prosperity. I stepped forward from the crowd, my heart burning. I shouted that loyalty meant nothing when built on lies. The crowd fell silent, eyes turning toward me. The merchant sneered when he saw me, his voice sharp as he asked who dares to interrupt him. I raised the papers in my hand and answered that I am Fani, daughter of the man you destroyed, daughter of the woman you broke, and today, I carry the proof of your corruption. Gasps filled the air. The merchant's face turned pale. He roared that I was a liar, that my parents were thieves and deserved their fate. My hands trembled, but my voice did not break. I said that these contracts show how you forged debts against my father, how you bribed officials, how you stole from traders who trusted you. I threw the documents into the crowd, and many hands reached for them. Murmurs grew into shouts as people read the names, the figures, the undeniable truth. Officials turned away in shame, traders cursed loudly, and the people who once bowed to him now spat at the ground. The merchant screamed that it was all false, but his words were drowned by the fury of the crowd. For the first time, he looked small, a man trapped by his own greed, and I felt the weight of my parents' memory pressing against my chest. Their voices whispered in the silence of my heart. The moment of vengeance was finally at hand. Fani stood in the quiet evening light, her eyes fixed on the people who once mocked her and tried to destroy her family. She had faced humiliation, betrayal, and endless whispers that said she would never rise. But here she was, stronger than ever. The house behind her was no longer the broken place where her tears used to fall. It was now a home filled with light and strength. Every brick carried her determination, and every corner held her victory. The people who once laughed at her family now stood silent, their faces pale, their words stolen by the weight of guilt. Fani did not shout at them. She did not curse them. She simply smiled. That smile cut deeper than any revenge could. "You tried to bury me," she said, her voice steadier. "You tried to crush my family. But what you never understood was that pain does not kill us. It makes us unshakable." Silence wrapped around the street. No one dared to answer. Even those who once stood proudly against her lowered their heads. The power had shifted, and it was Fani who now held it without even raising her hand. Her younger brother walked beside her, holding her hand. He looked up at her with pride. His sister was no longer the girl who cried herself to sleep. She was the woman who turned wounds into weapons and weakness into fire. Fani walked forward past her enemies, leaving them behind like shadows. The future belonged to her, not to those who had tried to break her. The story of her family was no longer one of suffering, but of survival and triumph. Every step she took declared victory without needing a single word. And with each step, the past lost its grip. The world finally saw her not as a victim, but as a warrior. The revenge was complete, not in destruction, but in her unshakable rise.